Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With Israel cutting off all aid to Gaza and Hamas rejecting Israel's changes to their ceasefire deal, is a new wave of destruction against Gaza and the indiscriminate killing of Palestinians about to reignite? Let's get to the bottom line. The exchange of more than 1,900 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel in exchange for the release of 25 Israeli captives held by Hamas and the return of remains of 8 others finalizes phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. At the start of what was expected to be the initiation of phase 2, Hamas still holds captive 59 Israelis, 24 of whom are believed to be alive and 25 deceased. This phase 2 of the agreement calls for negotiations to end the war, to withdraw Israeli troops entirely from Gaza, and to surge humanitarian aid, and ultimately to secure the remaining 59 Israeli captives. But that phase 2 of the agreement is now hanging by a thread, as Israel has stopped all aid trucks from entering Gaza, and Hamas has rejected Israel's call for extending the ceasefire without taking these other steps to withdraw its forces. Nerves are on edge as Prime Minister Netanyahu has now resumed threats of restarting the destruction. In addition, this week, Arab states made their own $53 billion Gaza redevelopment proposal focused on rebuilding Gaza by 2030, a proposal already rejected by the United States and Israel. President Donald Trump has now instead called for the relocation of all 2 million Gaza-based Palestinians and has tweeted out an AI-created depiction of himself and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu lounging in swimming trunks on a beach before exotic towers and a resort in Gaza, calling it the Riviera of the Middle East, a depiction of the real estate development he wants after Palestinians are removed with no right of return. Today, we're talking with Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Mideast Project and a former Israeli government negotiator. Levy recently testified before the UN Security Council on Gaza and Israel. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us today. Look, let's just get right down to it. Right now, we've seen largely most of phase 1 of this negotiated deal and a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel completed with the exchange of prisoners for captives that Hamas had taken. Now we're looking at whether phase 2 has any chance of moving forward. What is your take on this?
We did have the implementation of phase 1, Steve. There were lacunae, there were gaps in that implementation. Primarily, and factually, this is just to acknowledge that primarily those gaps were on things that the Israeli side committed to and did not deliver. And perhaps the most significant, although not in terms of its immediate impact on people's lives, was Israel's refusal to engage in negotiations over phase 2. They didn't send a team. Those were supposed to begin on day 16. It's questionable whether they've actually begun right to this day. Because, and this goes to your question of what are the prospects now? Phase 2, phase 3, the continuation of this was supposed to see the continued Israeli military withdrawal up to and including a final withdrawal of all troops and a permanent ceasefire. Israel has systematically refused that, continues to refuse that, and is putting things into the mix which were not in the agreed framework. One of the things that we have to take into account is that the Israeli Prime Minister, and he repeated this in the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, on March 3rd, has said, if Hamas doesn't give up the rest of the Israelis being held, then there will be hell to pay. If Hamas does give them up, then we're still going to resume the war on Gaza. So that's not a way to try and secure a deal. And the question is, amongst others, will the U.S. itself abrogate the terms of the deal which this administration, the Trump administration, Envoy Witkoff, have taken credit in achieving? Will they now go along with Israel in moving the goalposts? If they do, I don't think we're going to have the continuation of a ceasefire. We will not get phase 2. Israel is trying to get an extension of phase 1. I don't think that's going to be achievable, certainly not in a sustainable way. And by the way, if the U.S. negotiates something, and then itself withdraws from what it has endorsed, been a guarantor of, I think that has implications well beyond Gaza and the Middle East in the world we're in today.
Well, since you've touched that rail, I want to go right into it. President Trump tweeted out an AI-generated image of himself with Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, sitting in swimming trunks in front of, towers, what they call the Riviera of the Middle East, of a Gaza that has no Palestinians in it, a resort. So I'm just asking, that's part one. Part two is President Trump has endorsed the cutting off of all humanitarian aid to Gaza right now, which Israel has stopped trucks from going in, which last time I checked was a violation of humanitarian law and a crime against humanity in international legal terms. So I guess my question to you is here, is it the end where you have the President of the United States no longer basically as, I won't even call him a fair arbiter, but someone trying to be part of a process of reaching an equilibrium between both of these sides?
So look, Steve, we have to acknowledge that the predecessor administration, under the circumstances of the last year and a half, the Biden administration, of course, itself was complicit in those war crimes. It offered not only the weaponry, but the diplomatic, political, economic, legal cover, tried to at least, to the Israeli side. And its diplomacy was also conspicuously a failure. Now, let's acknowledge that Netanyahu looked at the new American political reality and said, will I have to move a little bit? If these guys want a ceasefire, I don't want to get off on the wrong foot with them. There were probably good reasons he thought that. However, having gotten Netanyahu to a ceasefire, and I'm not suggesting this administration has a broader agenda on human rights or international law or Palestinian liberation, far from it, but having at least gotten to that ceasefire, which is really important, and to an end to this particular and very ugly and devastating round of war, does the administration now want to do a U-turn on that? Because there are a couple of things going on. One, as you say, this is a war crime. What is being, look, the forced displacement of the Palestinian population, the idea of the Riviera, is a war crime. Withholding the humanitarian aid, preventing the access of those supplies is one of the reasons Israel is being tried for genocide, and Israel has urgent measures already stipulated by the International Court of Justice in the South Africa case, which Israel has ignored, and one of the reasons why the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his former defense minister, precisely for using starvation as a weapon of war and other things. So this is active complicity in those war crimes. It is also, Steve, the empowering of the most extreme elements inside Israel. I think we've seen remarkable resilience from the Palestinian population. I don't think we're going to see their successful forced removal, but it encourages that very trend at a moment of such extremism and let's use the term because it's correct in this respect, genocidal danger. To encourage that is the worst possible place you could put yourself as a US or any other administration. And then you have the other element, which is the grotesque, the bizarre, the inhumane and ugly, which is in that AI-generated video and which we have been hearing and seeing, witnessing from the actions of the Israeli government. And just the other day, an Israeli government spokesman, David Metzer, turned around, and I think it's of a genre with that AI-generated movie. He turned around and said, there's so much food in Gaza that we could have an obesity epidemic. Now, what kind of sickness is that when you talk in those terms? The next thing they're going to be telling us is when we see the gaunt images of starving Palestinians, it's that they're overdosing on Ozempic. I mean, what kind of inhumanity have we descended to here, both in Israel and in the U.S.?
Daniel, I watched your 12-minute presentation to the UN Security Council. It was very powerful. But one of the things you did at the beginning was to put a human face on this drama, to talk about those captives have been released. A woman, Noah Argaman, was there. You recognized her and talked about her partner who is still being held. But one of the things that you said, and I want to read it, you said a minute of silence for each of the Mideast children would be appropriate, as would a minute of silence for each of more than 18,000 Palestinian children murdered in Israel's devastation of Gaza, many more under the rubble. That silence would extend to over 300 hours. That really, really caught my attention. I mean, I'm just wondering, was that heard among those people you were speaking to? Do they understand the level of trauma that the Palestinian side have endured, in addition to the trauma that I know that Israelis have endured from October 7th? But the scale of response, is that resonating from your perspective?
I cannot know, Steve. It was very important for me to say, absolutely, I want people to hear the personal stories of these Israelis. It was important to hear Noah Argaman, who had been held, who was in the room, you know, her resilience, how she got through. And can we really not accord that same acknowledgement of equality, of humanity, of dignity to the Palestinians? Because time and again, what we have heard through this conflict is attempts to have us see ourselves reflected in those Israelis, but an equal attempt, an intent to maintain Palestinians as this unidentifiable, de-individualized, dehumanized mass. And that dehumanization is the path to war crimes. That's the path to no longer seeing these people as children of an equal God, as born equal. I hope it landed. I hope other things that were said there and have been said elsewhere landed. It was an attentive room. I can say that much. But of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And are we actually going to now see the continued ability on the Israeli side, enabled by the US, to impose the kinds of conditions on Palestinians, which inevitably, but also with forethought, with malice of forethought, cause death, destruction, suffering, starvation. And so putting a stop to that means holding the Israeli side accountable in ways which it conspicuously has not been held to account thus far.
We recently heard President Trump address both chambers of Congress. It's not the State of the Union address, but it's what presidents do when they come in, starting a new term. And they often have people in the gallery that they refer to help reinforce elements of their speech. And Noah Argaman was one of his guests, as were other former captives of Hamas were in the gallery. But in this hour and 40-long minute speech, that is the longest speech of any president before a joint convening of Congress, he made one comment. He says, "We're getting our hostages back." That's it. Were you surprised by the lack of attention, even of those that had been made their way out, have been released, rescued, or released by Hamas, not making a bigger deal? And do you think it's because many of these former captives are actually calling on Israel to live by the terms of the agreement that they agreed to on the ceasefire deal?
So I can't speak to the motivations of President Trump as he treated everybody to 1 hour and 40 minutes of a monologue. What we can say, and it's important that you brought this up, Steve, is we have the Israeli government telling us Hamas is the obstacle. We often have the US government and others telling us Hamas is the obstacle. And I don't want to suggest that Hamas are the most easygoing negotiator. They will hold out for things that they consider important in a deal. I think what we've seen throughout this is quite a realist position on their part, which is different from an easy position. But what you have is a plurality. So many of the families of those still being held, Israeli families of those still being held in Gaza, families of those who've been killed, who know the fate of their loved ones, of those who have been released, of those who come out in the context of these deals. And that's how the vast majority of those who have emerged alive have emerged, the overwhelming majority. We have seen those people time and again take to the squares and the towns of Israel to tell us that the obstacle to a deal, the ones sabotaging this deal, are Netanyahu and his henchmen. You had one of the mothers of someone still being held, Einav Zangalker. Her son Matan is assumed still to be alive in Gaza, saying just the other day that the Israeli prime minister had sent a fake delegation to hold fake talks in order to intentionally sabotage the prospects of continuing a ceasefire, and with the intention of blaming Hamas. So those people are in a unique position. But they have, over months and months, when the Israelis kept telling them, go around the world, tell the world that you have to put pressure on Hamas. Through those months, they reached the conclusion. And they reached that conclusion because the evidence became overwhelming over time. That Prime Minister Netanyahu, for his own personal, political, legal, and ideological, let's not forget that there's not an ideology here,
right,
considerations, is preventing this from happening.
Is the imperative of maintaining and completing this ceasefire, the release of all the Israelis, your partner included, the exchange of prisoners, the full Israeli military withdrawal, the surging of humanitarian assistance, which should never have been prevented. That requires the parties to implement their commitments. It will require the withheld Palestinian prisoner release to be made good on. It requires the role of the guarantors. There is good reason to fear that this could collapse. There is good reason to fear a resumption of those tragedies, and in particular, a possible renewed attempt to permanently depopulate the north of Gaza.
Is it realistic to suggest that the Arab plan to put forward a rebuilding plan for northern Gaza is a legitimate and reasonable alternative to depopulation? And if you do depopulate northern Gaza, where do those people go?
So, first of all, Steve, as you know, when it comes to alternatives, and we should never be talking about the need for an alternative to depopulation, to forced displacement, because that's a crime. We should never have to have this conversation. But here we are. We are having that conversation. The Arab Summit was important in putting out very clearly both some granular details as well of what are the phases, how each part of Gaza could be constructed, what that would require. They put some numbers on that. They made the point, and these were important points to make, that any forced displacement is absolutely unacceptable, that one has to talk about the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank as well, there is now over 40,000 who have been displaced, and Netanyahu proudly asserted in that same Knesset speech that this is the largest Israeli military operation in the West Bank since the taking of the West Bank in 1967. So you do have an alternative. What you also have is a US president who may not return to it, but thus far he hasn't walked it back, who has put forward this displacement. You have an Israeli government, elements of which have been very clear that their overall goal is to finish the job of ethnically cleansing Palestinians. We won't do a history class, but why are Palestinians in Gaza living in refugee camps in the first place? Because of previous displacements, the Nakba, previous rounds of ethnic cleansing. The danger, I would suggest, in that combination of an extremely permissive environment created by the US and an extremely radical ideological environment in Israel, is that if Israel does resume its assault on Gaza, I think there's good reason to believe that in the north there would be a declared intent of permanently taking the north of Gaza as the price Palestinians, this would be the Israeli position,
right,
would pay for October 7th. And then if you push Palestinians permanently into central and southern Gaza, you have an even more crowded, impossible environment. And that could be seen as a precursor to pushing them out. But the but is really important here, Steve. We've seen the Palestinians understand what displacement means. We've seen their resilience. We've seen the surrounding countries saying, if they have a right to return anywhere, they have a right to return to their homes. This is me now, inside Israel, but they're not coming here. By the way, if you want to turn Jordan and Egypt into resistance states, that's how you go about doing it. And there's a real question whether inside Israeli society, with its divisions, not around how well we should treat the Palestinians, but around how far we can go, will the reservists show up again and again? Will the economy survive? So I'm not sure Israel is capable of sustaining this when it is setting itself up as a revisionist power that threatens stability across the region. And this isn't a region that's going to easily accept that at the end of the day.
Daniel, I just got a minute left in this powerful discussion, but I want to ask you about whether Israel is all on board with this. Are there weaknesses inside Israel that we should be aware of as this onslaught is being threatened again, as you see the peace deal, the ceasefire deal, I should say, hanging by a thread? What are the things on there in a minute, if we can?
Yeah, and that's important to point out, because inside Israel, the center of gravity, of course, has been this issue around the Israelis held in Gaza, and the question that this is not Netanyahu's priority. And so when you see people mobilized, it's primarily around that. But I think it speaks to a deeper malaise of a social contract having been broken in the way October 7th was handled. We've had Israeli commissions of inquiry by the different military organs. None of them, and the political echelon and the Israeli political system has not yet turned around and said, there's a deeper problem here of root causes. You and I remember, Steve, when it came to asking the questions in America about the Iraq War, Congress commissioned an Iraq War study group, and that looked at root causes. In Israel, the conversation about root causes isn't happening, but the ability of society to sustain this onslaught, I think, is beginning to reach its crashing point.
Fascinating. Well, Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Mideast Project, I always appreciate your candor and for you being with us today. Thank you so much.
It's so good to be with you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? The fear that my guest, Daniel Levy, expressed in his testimony before the UN Security Council that the future of Gaza will be defined by a zero-sum approach is extremely important, as that framing has already taken hold at the highest levels of the U.S. government backing Israel. What this means is that the future of Gaza is now dictated by Arabs who see a future with Gaza with Palestinians, but with many of the governance issues unresolved. And on the other side, Israel and the current president of the United States seeing most of Gaza permanently depopulated by the Palestinians now living there. They're not seeing a future where both Israelis and Palestinians are both in these lands coexisting. The story of Israel and Gaza these last 18 months has been tragic, one of horrors on both sides, and of now the annihilation of not Hamas, but rather of Palestinian schools, hospitals, shops, community centers, and the indiscriminate killing of Palestinians, so many of whom are innocent men, women, and children. And the solutions to the crisis now, at the end of phase 1 of the agreement, and efforts to move to phase 2 are incredibly fragile, and in my view, unlikely to take hold. Mostly because those with the guns and bombs want to keep shooting them and dropping them. The meta story here is about the zero-sum outcome that Levy worries about, the outcome potentially with zero Gazans in Gaza. And that's the bottom line.